Good afternoon. Welcome. On behalf of the Center for International Studies, I'm John Tirman, and I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this panel, an excellent collection of experts on Syria, on chemical weapons, on U.S. policy. So we'll have a very spirited conversation. They will present for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have time for your questions and comments. Questions more than comments, I hope. I would like to first alert you to some other events that are coming up that are being sponsored by the center, and you can always view our calendar on our website if you have any questions about times, locations, etc. The website is mit.edu/CIS. On Tuesday, September 17th, Peaceful Coexistence, Deterrence, and Active Defense in China's East China Sea Strategy, which will feature Dennis Blasco, a former U.S. Army and Marine intelligence officer specializing in China, and Dr. Liselott Ottergaard, an associate professor at the Royal Danish Defense College. So that's on China and security. On Thursday, September 19th, a book talk with Christian Karl, who is a widely published author in New York Review of Books and other places, on his new book called Strange Rebels, 1979 and the Birth of the 21st Century. Should be quite good. That will be in Building 66-110. The China bit on the 17th will be in E40 on the 4th floor. Then we have another event on Syria, which is a photography exhibit by a well-known photographer who has worked for Perry Match, Time Magazine, Newsweek, the Boston Globe, and many others, Jonathan Alpery. So photos from the front. He was held in captivity by some rebels in Syria for 3 months. Let's have some interesting things to say. And finally in this series, just taking us up to the first week of October, another book talk by Chase Madar, who's a civil rights attorney, on his book, The Passion of Bradley Manning. And he'll be introduced, so it'll be about, obviously, Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower, and all the issues that come with that, and he'll be introduced by Noam Chomsky. That will be at 5 o'clock in Building 10250. So, again, look on our website if you need to remind yourself of what those are and where they are. Today, we have the ever-changing, hour-by-hour drama of Syria and chemical weapons and the U.S. response to that, the international community's response. And our guests today are very well qualified to address these matters. First speaking will be Augustus Richard Norton, who is professor of international relations and anthropology at the at Boston University. He has written very extensively on the Middle East. His book on Hezbollah is coming out in a new edition in January. He's advised the government, he's advised the military, he's taught at West Point, a very widely respected and, I can say from my personal experience, insightful analyst of Middle East politics. Jeanne Guillemin will speak second. She is a sociologist and anthropologist who has for many years been working on chemical weapons and biological weapons and other nasty things. She is the author of American Anthrax, Fear, Crime, and the Investigation of the Nation's Deadliest Bioterrorist Attack, which was published 2 years ago. She is a senior advisor to the Security Studies program here and really recognized as one of the leading experts on chemical weapons. And then Barry Posen will come third. Barry, many of you know, is Ford International Professor of Political Science here at MIT, director of the Security Studies program, and one of the leading international relations theorists in the world. So, a good lineup. And so would you please help me welcome Richard Norton.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. The question of Syria and what the U.S. response should be to the ongoing Syrian civil war is, of course, the question of the moment. I'd like to begin by underlining that I'm not a pacifist. Part of my biography that John didn't mention is that I was an officer in the United States Army. I led soldiers in combat for several years, spent about 3 years of my life in combat zones in one capacity or another. And I'm not, on principle, opposed to the use of force, but my premise for any use of national power is we should have a very good idea of what we're trying to accomplish with that power. And I think the Syrian case is particularly vexing in that regard. Let me begin by offering a couple of comparative comments. I've spent several years in Lebanon, including a couple of years during the Civil War in Lebanon, which ended in 1990. I was able to travel reasonably easily because for a significant part of that time I was working for the UN. But Lebanon War, in terms of total casualties, was in many ways equally or even more horrendous than the Syrian civil war, still counting. Over 100,000 died in Lebanon, a country during the time of the Civil War of about 3 million people. So just think about that. However, it seems to me that in many ways it was easier to end the Lebanese civil war than it's likely to be to end the Syrian civil war. In Lebanon, there were no serious attempts to fragment the state. There were talks about the establishment of, autonomous areas and all of that. But for the most part, the belligerents accepted the premise that their focus was a definitive state of Lebanon. And when the war ended, it ended with the accepted norm of no victor, no vanquished. And in fact, one might even add that it ended with a settlement in 1990, which was very similar to a settlement that had been on the table in 1976. Moreover, Lebanese institutions survived the war. The Lebanese army participated in some of the battles, but not many of them. The defense ministry maintained itself as a kind of independent entity. Other ministries of government continued to function. And indeed, throughout the Lebanese Civil War, even annual baccalaureate examinations were routinely administered throughout the country, except for 82 when Israel invaded. So in Lebanon, which was a horrendous experience, certainly for the Lebanese who survived that civil war, I think we have a case that was, on analysis, easier to conclude than what we're seeing in Syria, where the army is very much associated with one side in the civil war, where the ministries are very much associated with one side in the civil war, where there is no representative body that's likely to be accepted as legitimate by all of the Syrian citizens, unlike Lebanon, where it was actually the parliament which was the mechanism for making the agreement that ended the war. Now I turn to another case, Iraq. Iraq was certainly a very, very horrible place in the mid years of the first decade of this new century, 2006, 2007. In 2006, there were arguably 1 out of every 7, perhaps 1 out of every 6 Iraqis had been misplaced, or displaced, I should say, by the fighting, or were refugees externally. Compare that to Syria. Nowadays, it's something like 1 out of every 4 Syrians. So we have a case where, in many ways, by many of the metrics that we measure these horrible events, we find really a much more difficult situation in Syria. Moreover, we see an extraordinary fragmentation of the opposition. It's true, as the press has noted, that there is an entity called the Free Syrian Army. It's certainly true that there are significant jihadist elements that comprise part of the opposition, Jabhat al-Nusra most notably. But by some counts, there are hundreds, and one expert even argues 1,200 different militia factions. Some are quite small. There's a lot of fluidity between these militias. So, for example, one of them, the so-called Free Martyrs Battalion, which is in Jabal al-Zawiya in Idlib, in the northwestern part of the country, they have about 150 fighters. They only have 1 automobile between them. Very limited equipment. So what do you see? You see fluidity. You see people moving from one group to the other. Militia leaders frequently control weapons, so they'll retain control of the weapons, but people might move to other groups where they have different kinds of weapons. People might be traded between one group and another. So consolidating this opposition into any kind of coherent political force is not impossible, but it's certainly something that's going to take a great deal of time. And in contrast to Iraq and to Lebanon, Syria is fragmenting already. In the northeast, we see a significant segment of the population, Kurds, finding sanctuary within Iraq. Upwards of 150, perhaps 175,000 Kurds right now in Iraq. These are people who are citizens of Syria, although the government removed their citizenship for periods of time, accusing them of being non-Syrians, of being Turks, which they're not. But you have that segment of the population which seems to be in the process of fragmenting from Syria. And of course, the borders of Syria are quite porous and permeable. The Lebanese border with Syria is not well demarcated. There are actually Lebanese villages and Lebanese citizens who are living on what seems to be the Syrian side of the border when you look at the map. Some 21 villages in that situation. In some cases, villages which cannot be reached from Lebanon, but only from Syria. Many of those villages happen to have a strong Shi'i Muslim composition. To the east, the Syrian border, particularly with Al-Anbar province, the large, predominantly Sunni province in Iraq, is a border over which there's very easy movement, smuggling and that kind of thing, lots of tribal alliances, lots of intermarriage. So you have lots of people who are connected socially with tribes, kin groups, and so on outside of Syria. In Lebanon, it's estimated that as many as 200,000 marriages involve Lebanese and Syrians being married. We have equally significant numbers on the Syrian Iraqi side. So the extent to which the borders of Syria are likely to remain intact over time is at least a question and a puzzle. So my question is, what is the ability of the U.S. in this kind of fluid situation in which politics are in many ways inchoate, particularly amongst the opposition? Will the use of force what will the use of force by the U.S. accomplish? It's really the $64 question. I'm familiar with other instances where we have used force because, well, we had to do it. I remember when I was teaching at West Point during the term of the first President Bush, Somalia was an issue of great concern. In fact, I remember sitting down one time. I used to travel to Washington to meet with the Army Chief of Staff on occasion, and he said, we have to do something about Somalia. We didn't know anything about Somalia. And in fact, the reference on Somalia, this is precisely true, for many of the desk officers in the Pentagon was a photocopied article from my grandfather's edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is the classic 1911 edition, which has a great essay on Somaliland, because most of the recent materials at that time, in the 1980s and 90s, was very much couched in a kind of Marxist, in the context of sort of East-West struggle and that kind of thing. There wasn't really much knowledge about Somali society. We know that didn't work out very well. In Lebanon in 1982, when the U.S. intervened by sending in a force of Marines with a very vague order as part of a multinational force, they were sent in literally to maintain a presence, whatever that means. That didn't work out particularly well. So we have to have a clear mission. We have to understand what the use of force is going to do, whether it's going to be boots on the ground or it's going to be the application of force through air-launched cruise missiles and standoff weapons and so on. And of course, there's always the risk that upon the application of force, we don't accomplish very much. The government that the U.S. would like to see transitioned out of power remains in power, sort of crowing its survival, and of course a strong temptation to sort of up the ante. So on the one hand, while I certainly abhor what happened on August 21st, and I hold no particular brief for the Syrian government led by President Bashar al-Assad, I'm puzzled as to what we expect to accomplish by the use of force. And I must say that up to now, I haven't been able to answer that question for myself, nor do I think it's been answered for many other Americans who are watching the situation so intensely. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming today. It's such a difficult situation, such a terrible subject. I'm going to talk to you about arms control issues. In my little corner of the world, everything that's going on in Syria now looks like a colossal failure or missed opportunity in arms control. I'll explain a little bit more about that. I'm going to ask 3 questions. I'm going to hope I can answer them. The first one is, why were chemical weapons invented and used? For those of you who know your World War I history, you can answer this question for yourself. Chemical weapons were invented in order to overcome the obstacles of land warfare, trench warfare, stalemates. What can you do about it? Well, one of the things, if you were German, you could do about it was to invent chlorine gas, put it in canisters, and on April 22nd, 1915, at the Battle of Ypres, you could release the chlorine gas on the enemy troops. And because the chlorine, there were, 5,700 canisters along a 4-mile battle line. And when the wind was in the right direction, the order was given to manually release the chlorine gas over to the trenches of the enemy. The enemy were mostly Canadian and Algerian soldiers, and the estimate is that about 6,000 of them died of asphyxiation. And what happened, of course, is the chlorine comes over, and chemical weapons are heavy, by the way. They blow, they disperse, but then they settle. Well, they settle, they pool right into the trenches. and the impact was really enormous. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but that was the beginning of a really intense arms race. That is, when the UK figured out what the Germans had done, they began testing compounds to find out what kinds of chemical weapons they could use against the Germans. The Russians got in it and began testing compounds and using them. The Italians got in to this game, and it was a very, very intense race to get better and better chemical weapons. When the war was over, the revulsion on the part of ordinary people, especially in the UK, also in the United States, which came in late in the war and also engaged in the arms race, was so intense. You've probably seen the paintings of the men blinded or burnt by mustard gas, leaning one on another in a line. The revulsion was so intense that it really did propel, especially the United Kingdom, but other nations in the West, to create the Geneva Protocol. So the Geneva Protocol, which you hear a lot about lately, has, am I too close to the mic? Okay, should I bend it down? I'll back up. I'll make it easier for everyone. Thank you. So, so the Geneva Protocol comes into existence because, in part, of the revulsion that people felt against chemical weapons, because its main idea was to ban chemical weapons. Now, it has an add-on provision that says that the nations that are party to the treaty will also ban bacteriological weapons. That was the phrasing of the time was bacteriological weapons. So let me just give you the phrasing from the Geneva Protocol, which then becomes important today. It says that the parties who agree to this treaty prohibit the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and of all analogous liquids, materials, or devices. And in addition, they extend this prohibition to the use of bacteriological methods of warfare. So that's pretty simple. But what's not simple about the Geneva Protocol is that it had a reservation clause. That is, you could sign on and become a party, but you could claim the reservation that you would use chemical or biological weapons in retaliation in kind, and that you claim that reservation. This is very important because if you claim the reservation, you claim the right to build up a defensive arsenal. And that's what many countries not many, but some key countries, the major powers certainly did. They signed on to the Geneva Protocol, they ratified it, and then they built up arsenals, chemical and, in a few cases, biological arsenals, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but then they move into the offensive realm, because how do you know when you've crossed that line? So that provision in the Geneva Protocol is important because it allows, again, an arms race to continue on through most of the rest of the century. The United States is not a party to the Geneva Protocol. My second question, by the way, here now is, why did it take 50 years for the United States to become a party to the Geneva Protocol? Well, that's a long story, and that's an interesting arms control story. The first part of it is that there were isolationists in the 1920s who just didn't want any part of any international treaty. They didn't care. All right, so we didn't ratify it then. But then, as we move into World War II, there's a move to keep your options. So the United States, for example, wants its chemical weapons options. Interestingly enough, chemical weapons are not used in World War II by the major parties, the major combatants, one against another. So the nations that were involved in World War II do not use chemical weapons against each other. I'm saying the major powers because we did have the instance of Japan using chemical weapons and also biological weapons against the Chinese. But that's an issue apart. So 50 years go by, and finally, the United States ratifies the Geneva Protocol. At the same time it ratifies the Geneva Protocol, it brings into force, after a lot of toing and froing, what's called the Biological Weapons Convention. Now, at this point, you have to thank Richard Nixon. We don't like to thank Richard Nixon for much of anything, but please thank Richard Nixon for, number one, in 1969, renouncing biological weapons in the United States, completely shutting down the US program. Now, here's the difference. It's not about use. Now it's about capability. So if you have no biological weapons program, you don't have the capability, and therefore you're not going to use them. So Richard Nixon very conscientiously gets rid of biological weapons and begins to build toward a biological weapons convention. Well, he was out of office, unfortunately, when it all came to fruition. But 1975 is a key year because it's the year in which you find the Biological Weapons Convention is being signed and actually on its way to ratification. And 1975 is the year that the U.S. actually ratifies the Geneva Protocol. Okay, so that was question number 2. We get through that. Question number 3, what is the Chemical Weapons Convention? The Chemical Weapons Convention is a parallel to the Biological Weapons Convention. So the idea is if a state party signs on to the Chemical Weapons Convention, it agrees to basically get rid of its program. Just stop it, right? The program is over. And then it also agrees to destroy everything that it has made, if it has made anything. Let me just read you some of the Chemical Weapons Convention language so that you understand what it says. It says, the states party to the convention undertake never under any circumstances to develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, or retain chemical weapons, or transfer, directly or indirectly, chemical weapons to anyone, or to use chemical weapons, or to engage in any military preparation to use chemical weapons. They also agree to prohibit in any way, to assist, encourage, induce anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under the convention. You can see how complete that is. But there's more. See, up to that part, we're looking at Biological Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention. But the Chemical Weapons Convention went further. And at this point, I think you have to remember the context. This is 1993. The 1980s was marred by Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons against Iran and also against Kurdish villagers, notoriously. So the state parties, it says, should also destroy chemical weapons that it owns or possesses or that are located in any place over which it has jurisdiction or control. And if it's abandoned chemical weapons, it should actually destroy those weapons no matter where they are. So this is in reference, by the way, to the arms buildup in chemical weapons that went on, if you go from 1970 up until 1993, it's a tremendous proliferation of arsenals. It's in small states, it's mostly in the United States and in the Soviet Union. But it's really a lot of stuff, and it's all around the world. So you need the commitment of a lot of nations, and fortunately, the commitment of the nations has been very high. There are 188 states parties right now. There is one who was always included in as a signatory, that's Israel, but Israel is not a party to the treaty, it's a signatory. It's a preliminary state, if you will. So anyway, the Chemical Weapons Convention says you have to destroy this stuff, right, all these bad things. And then it also provides for a standing organization, and that organization is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And I think you're hearing a lot about that now. OPCW, people keep saying OPCW, OPCW. It's the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And that's has a staff of maybe 300 to 400 people, usually pretty underfunded, but they do go around the world and they teach people how you go about getting rid of your horrible stockpiles and destroying whatever it is you have. Now, not a lot of countries have that. So one of the other things OPCW does is it goes around the world and it teaches people how to verify anywhere the existence of stockpiles. That is, how to detect them or how to verify them in terms of laboratory work, which is very important as we're learning now. So the OPCW teams are very skilled. They've been working on this since 1997 when the Chemical Weapons Convention came into force. That is when it really is off the ground and running and ratified by enough states to make it important. So I think one of the things we want to remember here as we consider the option that Russia now has put on the table is that the burden in a normal situation, this is not a normal situation, the burden of action is on the state. Let's say Syria were a state party to the treaty. The burden of action and initiative is on the state. The state pays, for example, for the inspectors to come in. They pay for the destruction of stockpiles. They pay for the destruction of facilities, because destruction of facilities is also part of getting rid of that awful program, or the conversion of facilities to such a degree that they would not pose a hazard to the rest of the world. So the burden is on the state, but in this case, as we were just hearing, we don't have the state to put the burden on. So this is really very perplexing. The safety of the inspectors has to be ensured when they go in to any environment. These are not people trained for warfare. These are people who are expecting to go into peaceful environments. There would have to be some sort of ceasefire if that were even possible. And then there's a long list of things which they have to do in order to verify and then help the state destroy the stockpiles. So again, it's not the UN and it's not Russia and it's not the United States that would destroy anything within Syria. It's supposed to be the state of Syria that actually destroys whatever it has. With the assistance of OPCW, the OPCW people are there really more as helpers, as observers, and also to verify what has been done. So I think you can see what our problems here are here. And I want to make just another small point here. I'll tell you one story, by the way, which is it's just kind of a nice story. In I think it was 1988, then Vice President George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, went before the United Nations to defend then ally to the United States, Saddam Hussein, against accusations that he had used nerve gas against the Kurdish villagers. His mother, Dorothy, apparently was furious with him. All right, so this is the story. I'm just telling you the story. She was very upset with him that he went forward, and just because you have an ally and the proof was there, and the World Health Organization had the proof that these people had been attacked with nerve gas. And the story as it continues is that George Bush then very vigorously promoted the Chemical Weapons Convention. So I think George Bush deserves a lot of credit, because without him, I don't think you would have had the United States moving forward to the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1993. And I was privileged to be at the signing in 1993. And it was a totally joyous and simply wonderful time. I mean, the euphoria was just amazing. People thought, now, finally, we can get rid of these awful weapons. It'll all be good. Everything will be good again. The 20th century was a disaster. You know, biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, all dangerous to civilians. Really all terrible for civilians. But now, look, we're coming out of it. There's going to be, you know, there's light at the end of this tunnel. So the second story, of course, is about a failed opportunity at the same time. That was the time when Israel stepped up and signed the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. Egypt and Syria did not. It was a perfect opportunity for Russia and the United States to put pressure on Syria in particular and just say, well, listen, your time has come. Israel can do it, you can do it, Egypt can do it. Let's have a Middle East that's really free of these kinds of weapons. By the way, like the initiative that's going on now with the NPT, to make a Middle East that's free of nuclear weapons. I know these are very utopian ideas and ideals, but I think they're very important. And when we forget arms control, or we put it on the back burner, or we don't fund it, then we get situations like the crisis we're in today. Thank you.
So I want to speak more directly to the events that have brought us together. What appears to be a large-scale use of chemical agents in Syria, and the Obama administration's consideration of what policies to do about that. And I just want to try and talk about really only two things, which is different ways of looking at what happened and why, and different reasons why the Obama administration may be so exercised. Because I think neither of these are so clear. I think it's my experience in trying to understand this event that facts are more elusive than they seem at first glance, not only about the event, but about the thinking of U.S. policymakers. There's quite a lot of hyperbole being used for the purpose of selling policies, which I think is getting in the way of having a serious conversation. And we're stuck in talking about it that everything is related to everything else. In other words, the kinds of policies one might choose in the aftermath of this event, sensibly choose, depend very much on your characterization of the event. So you don't really get to separate these two things. Now, the administration has adopted one particular interpretation of the event, but it's not the only possible interpretation of the event. And if you had a different interpretation, it might lead you to a different policy. So when people started talking about the event originally, and since then, there's been this kind of classic old-fashioned crime drama aspect to it. I mean, the question has been one about means and motive, Who had the means and the motive to do the killing? Who had the means and the motive to do the crime? The problem here is that the government most clearly had the means, and some factions within the rebel movement most clearly had the motive, right? So this makes it difficult going in to think this through. I think what we do know is that something very bad happened, and we know that that something had to do with a poison, that poison was inhaled, that poison was almost surely man-made, that poison was almost surely delivered by some set of military weapons. This is not an act of nature. And it was pretty big. In other words, we don't know exactly how many people were killed. The estimates range from 300 to 1,400. The U.S. government uses 1,400. Other governments have used 3. There's a set of wounded that identified with that, and people who were sick from the gas but not dead. That much we know. But beyond that, we don't really know very much. The U.S. government, the British government, the president in his speech has alluded to very tiny little tidbits of intelligence information that could suggest a particular interpretation, but don't necessarily. In fact, it's my view that if you scan the range of leaks from intelligence organizations, leaks that have not been countered or denied by those intelligence organizations here and abroad, I think you can come to the conclusion that the story is actually murky. So what would the rebel motive have been? I think it's quite clear. The president has tried to stay out of this war. There are other wars of this kind the United States has gotten into. If you can get the United States into the war with its Air Force, it's probably going to do some damage to the government. It's going to change the balance of power on the ground. It might even win the war for you. So you have an interest. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in the insurgent movement in Syria is ruthless enough to do a gas attack on their own people, but there are surely people in that movement who we know are incredibly ruthless, because we've seen the kinds of things their friends or allies or ideological confrere have done in Iraq. We've seen really hideous terrorist actions in Iraq. So I don't think you can rule out that there are some groups that might do something like this. The problem you have to ask is, where would they have gotten enough agent to do an attack of this kind? And it's basically two stories. One is less plausible, which is they concocted it themselves, and there have been efforts across this region to try and concoct your own chemicals, but it's not that plausible that they could do it. And then there are reports that that Syrian government agents have been lost to the insurgents in some cases. We don't know that this has actually happened. Maybe these inspections by the UN will tell us a little something about that. It's very hard to figure out whether this has occurred, and the Syrian regime hasn't admitted it, but of course the Syrian regime until yesterday didn't admit having chemicals. Since they didn't admit having chemicals, they weren't going to admit losing chemicals. All right, so there is at least this possibility. I'm not that confident You know, I'm not trying to make the argument that this is what happened. I actually think it probably wasn't what happened, but I don't think it's a dead argument yet, right? You still should keep an open mind to the possibility that this may have occurred, right? Because I'm trying to argue that the evidence is not decisive. Now, in the government's case, we're pretty sure the government has the means, as Jeanne has just told you. There's very little disagreement, across the expert community that there's a big chemical weapons program in Syria, and that they have lots of different ways to deliver the weapons. There's some evidence that some chemical weapons have been used by someone in the war so far. But the question is, what would cause the government to decide now to launch a pretty serious military attack in which multiple rockets were probably used? Now, I haven't tried to count it. I'm not an expert on chemical weapons. I don't know what kind of ground footprint you need or how many munitions you need to find to plausibly do this much damage. But it seems like, just impressionistically, that it would require a fairly serious action. So what would have precipitated such an action? I mean, since President Obama has more or less telegraphed that, at least heretofore, he wanted to stay out of this war, and the one thing that could bring him into this war is the large-scale use of chemicals, why would it be a rational act for a government that's trying to maintain power in a vicious civil war to do the one thing that gets American attention and potentially American military attention? In other words, this is a question of motive, right? It just doesn't seem that the motive would be very strong. Second, why would you do it during the weekend when the United Nations chemical inspectors are in town, in the same town that they're in? I mean, they're across town in Damascus, right? It's a very strange action for a regime that clearly wants to stay in power and is pretty cunning to undertake. And third, the war has been going better for the regime recently. Now, press accounts are always, they convey impressions that things are stronger than they are. It's not that the regime was winning, but they had stopped losing and they had started moving the things in their direction. So why take this risk? And finally, if the purpose was to terrorize or punish civilians, there's ostensibly 100,000 people dead in this war already. Not all of them are civilians, but many of them are. It's a great tragedy of warfare that without half trying, you end up killing a lot of civilians. If you really wanted to kill a lot of civilians, there's just lots of ways to do it besides chemicals, right? So when you try and look at the motives, right, it seems like the motives are pretty thin, despite the fact that the capability is there. Now, that said, if you listen to the president's speech, if you listen to John Kerry talk, if you listen to any of the president's spokespersons talk, this is the model of the event that's been adopted. In other words, this is the model of the event upon which U.S. policy, or the policies that they were advocating, was based, that there was a deliberate use of chemical weapons, a failure of deterrence, a vicious, crazy attack on your own people designed to do murder, right? That's the story, right? That's the story that the government is going with, right? Now, it's a story that, as I said, it doesn't make any sense, but it is consistent with the large capabilities that the government has. So I'm saying here, if you're doing a capabilities analysis, it's more credible that the government did it than that the rebels did it. But it's still not that credible from a motive point of view that the government would have done it deliberately. Now, in warfare, there's often mistakes, right? We have terms for this: fog of war, friction. There's often failures in the chains of command. This is a very chaotic war. This army, the Syrian army, is under terrific pressure. Large parts of the Syrian army, I think, spend their time policing other parts of the Syrian army to ensure they don't go over to the other side, right? It's a very strange and difficult war, right? So there's a number of ways that an event like this could have occurred. And, for example, German intelligence, which has had a signals intelligence ship off the coast of Lebanon and Syria for quite a long time. They briefed their own legislators over the last couple of weeks. Those briefings were leaked. The German intelligence position is that this action was probably some kind of mistake, because they have apparently quite a lot of message traffic in which There were requests going up the chain of command for the right to use chemical weapons, and there were denials that came down the Syrian chain of command over a long period of time. Now, they didn't say that they have information about this particular event, right? But they did say they have all this past information. Now, again, these are leaks, so this is what German intelligence was willing to share with German legislators, what German legislators were willing to share with German journalists. Okay, so this is all the kind of tenuous information we have to deal with. But we do know that this SIGINT chimp was there. We do know that the German signals intelligence in this part of the world is pretty good. We do know that, that the information that they've come up with in the past has been respected. So it's plausible, and it's consistent with leaks coming out of the U.S. intelligence community that came out pretty early in the game, that some of the message traffic that we picked up suggested that the Syrian regime, the higher-ups, were quite astonished at what happened, and we're asking down below, what just happened? What just happened? Right now, I'm not trying to put a gloss on this that said, gee, these guys are completely innocent. I don't think that's the case. Mistakes can happen in many ways. There could have been simple insubordination, right? That can happen. There could have been a simple mistake in which orders were misunderstood. It could have been a complex mistake related to the argument that's been advanced that the Syrians have dabbled in chemical weapons use, small-scale uses to trying to achieve some objective that's quite obscure, but supposedly we have many reports of this, using little bits. Well, you can imagine that somebody was given the order to use little bits, and several people who were meant to load the little bits, loaded big bits. If they were meant to fire one weapon, they fired 4 weapons. They were meant to fire a certain kind of weapon, they fired a larger weapon. So there's any number of ways you could have mistakes in this situation that could have produced what appears to be a large-scale use of chemical weapons. I also think it should be entertained, the hypothesis should at least be entertained, that some of what happened here may not have been about chemical weapons per se, it might have been about something else, right? So I'm prepared to believe that the UN will find that sarin, there are traces of sarin here, but the Syrian regime has used fuel-air explosives in the war, which is a nasty device not under the chemical weapons theory. It's an aerosol explosive. That aerosol is quite toxic. I'm not a chemist, so I can't tell you how toxic. But if the Syrians were using those munitions and they failed to detonate, you could have also gotten some problems from that. And I'm just saying there's lots of bits and pieces of things that could have occurred here to make this, the military has a term for this, which I will not share with you, but if you've been around, you know what this term is. It's a cluster something. So the argument here would be, and if this kind of story is plausible, and I actually personally find it to be the most plausible story, then the notion that deterrence failed in some black and white kind of way, and the U.S. government or the international community has to intervene to restore deterrence is not quite an accurate depiction of what occurred. And in point of fact, you could argue, not point of fact, but one could say that, gee, what we really have to do here is have a set of communications with Assad that says, look, you and your troops have been playing a game for some reason. You've been kind of, pulling the dragon's tail, or whatever the term is, edging up to using this stuff, and now you've seen what can happen, right? You don't have complete control. And it's only a matter of time, either before you do this again or you do something worse, right? And you can have a good giggle about where we are in terms of international support for doing something or American domestic support for doing this, but trust us, right? You're only going to get so many mistakes before we're going to build a consensus and the hammer is going to come down. You're never going to be able to use enough chemical weapons to win this war. So let's talk about how we can put more barriers between the stuff that you built for whatever reasons and uses that can only lead you into a situation of suicide, right? So that would have been a plausible approach consistent with the accident theory, right? So I'm just going to leave you with those 3 theories, and then I'm going to just run through what was it that the Obama administration was trying to achieve when it decided to opt for military action, right? Now, I think that if you listen to the speeches, there are 4 different stories embedded in the speeches of the president and his advisors, right? The first one is the one that's consistent with what Jeanne was talking about, that there's been a slow, steady international effort to make the use of chemical weapons not only illegitimate, but essentially impossible on any kind of short timeline. These weapons are not that hard to build, so on a moderate timeline, any industrial power can get them back. But to try and push them far enough out of reach that so in a short timeline, nobody can get to them. Now, Jeanne can say more about the treaties. The treaties are complicated. When the president says, you know, there was a transgression here, sometimes the transgression is talked about as a transgression against the norm. Sometimes it's talked about as a transgression against international law. I'm not an international lawyer, but what I think is fair to say that one shouldn't view the state of the norm on chemical weapons as being equivalent to a U.S. federal law, right, against murder or any number of laws that a state would pass, right? This law and this norm are both contested, and the precise ways that they apply to Syria is just it's a little obscure, right? It's not that they don't apply, because these things are murky. Norms are murky. International customary law a little bit murky, right? But you know, the notion that this norm is locked in, that the law is locked in, that the Syrians violated some agreements that they had signed, and that the Americans have a duty and a right, to enforce this law, that last point is totally untrue. The Americans have neither the duty nor the right, right? Now, the argument here is international norm, right? So the question is, if you believe it's an international norm, which means a norm that should be self-reinforcing, a norm that should be based on the collective belief of the principal states in international politics, that this is simply something that's not done, then the way to enforce the norm and to strengthen the norm is to have it enforced and surveyed by international institutions. Now, even if, as the administration says, and I think correctly, you were not going to get a hunting license from the UN Security Council to go enforce this norm, which is actually what they, what you would want to do, it would have made sense to go through an elaborate process to try and get the international community to enforce this norm before the United States government arrogated to itself the enforcement of this norm. In other words, this was a moment, right? And the thing that's interesting to me is that the whole international process was dismissed pretty quickly because it wouldn't work, right? And I would say it doesn't matter if it works or not, right? If you care about the norm, you should go through the process of making it not work, which makes your unilateral enforcement of the norm more legitimate. Now, for those of us who are watching this, right, it looked to us like, and to the press, the United States government was going to war last Thursday, right, after very little of the international diplomacy had really been done, right? So and I'm not saying that that the administration doesn't believe this. I'm trying to weigh the relative power of various reasons in the convergent consensus in the administration that shooting was a good idea, right? So this was their first argument, right, is the normative one. The second one, which followed right along behind it, is sort of the classic Cold War credibility argument, that the president set a red line. When America sets red lines, that's just the way it is. And if somebody transgresses it, punishment has to follow ineluctably, because if it doesn't, dominoes all over the world will fall, right? And I'm caricaturing the argument here, but I don't think I'm caricaturing that much, right? Now, I think there are some tensions in this argument in terms of the way the administration looks forward to how the process of the application of force would unfold. The administration tells you we the Americans, and whoever wants to come along with us, will strike some set of targets that's small enough for you, the American public, not to worry about, and large enough to do egregious damage to the Syrian regime. And after that happens, the Syrians will sit quietly with their hands folded. They're not going to find some way to retaliate, creative or less creative, against us or against anybody else, because American power is so great they wouldn't dare. And then they say, and what about Israel? Oh, don't worry about Israel. Israeli power is so great they wouldn't dare. And I, by the way, happen to believe this, right? Israeli power is so great they wouldn't dare. And I would go you one better, no offense to Jeanne, since the Chemical Weapons Convention was signed, powers have used chemical weapons against those who cannot retaliate. Japan used them against powers that could not retaliate. Italy used them against powers that could not retaliate, right? The United States can retaliate. The Germans had chemicals in World War II. We had tons of chemicals in World War II. I asked Jeanne to tell you the story of the chemical leak at Bari, the Italian port of Bari, that Rick Atkinson talks about in his book on the Italian campaign. We had an entire ship loaded with mustard gas parked in Bari, and a bunch of German bombers got through, hit that ship. Nobody else knew that the ship was full of mustard gas. Mustard swept across the town. Many people died from mustard gas poisoning. Why do we have that gas there? We thought the Germans might use it. We were ready to use it in retaliation, right? So when the president is saying, you know, at the end of this strike, the Syrians will still have chemical weapons, but they wouldn't dare use it because we can deter them. Well, if you believe you can really slap them around, right, and then there's not going to be any reaction, you have to believe that American deterrent power is pretty strong and that Israeli deterrent power is pretty strong, right? So this argument that by not hitting the Syrians if they've crossed this red line, your credibility across the Middle East is going to collapse, is belied by their own confidence in the deterrent power of the combat capability of the United States of America and Israel and its other allies have, right? At least this is what my argument would be. Now, there's a third and related argument. It's kind of a credibility argument, but it's a more murky kind of reputation argument. And when the credibility argument is offered, some people go hyperbolic on you, and they start talking about how the North Koreans are going to take a lesson from what you're going to do or do not do here. But more often, the argument is that the Iranians will take a lesson, or our allies in the region will take a lesson. So there's a kind of a Middle East specific version of the credibility argument. It has to do with reputation. And this argument basically says, you know, the Middle East is a tough neighborhood. Only tough people get by here. Military power is used all the time. The fact that the president, our president, the president of the United States and the U.S. government has used military force many times in the Middle East, you know, and certainly many times since 2011, which, you know, 9/11, which is you know, we're observing today, right? Somehow that's not enough. You need a regular pattern of showing that you're tough and are willing to use force, right? This is an argument. Now, I actually can't dismiss it. Maybe Richard would like to say something later about, in the Q&A, about sort of the wisdom of this, you know, sort of this notion that you have to be showing your game face all the time, right? Now, this is a particularly important time for this question, because I think if you look across the Middle East, and again, I don't even want to put it this way, because some people gloat and say, American policy is in tatters. You know, I wouldn't even put it that way. I would put it a different way, which is in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, internal political forces are so strong right now. Divisions are so great, whether they're divisions about ideology or divisions about ethnicity or divisions about religion, that the United States just doesn't have very many cards to play to help calm things down. We just don't have very many cards to play, right? The released emotive political forces in the societies are just too potent, right? And the second thing is, it's not easy to find anyone that we really like, right? Whose values really reflect our own. Even if you had an idealist foreign policy, who's your guy? Or or women. Who's your faction, right? Where's the paladin, you know, the George Washingtons of their countries, right? They're very hard to find, right? So I think from the point of view of the administration, from the point of view of many people in the policy community, there's frustration. And, you know, it's easy to forget that not much more than, what was it, a week before this chemical attack happened, the Egyptian army, using American tanks, American bulldozers, American infantry fighting vehicles, went into these barricades that the political opposition was maintaining in the streets, and they rooted them out, and 500 Egyptians were killed by report, right? And the United States really didn't have a card to play. We just didn't have a card to play. We didn't like it, but we couldn't obey talk about credibility, we couldn't obey our own law, which says, gee, you know, there's a coup. We're really supposed to stop supplying military equipment to this country. Well, we're not going to call it a coup. We'll call it something else. We can make up whatever words we want, right? So anyway, I think there's a feeling that things aren't going so well in the Middle East, and it was tempting to say, look, we've got to show that we still have strength. Then the final thing, and then I'll shut up because, like, you know, everybody who knows me, I can't give a short talk. It's put a muscle relaxant in this jaw before I stand up and time it so that it stops at 10 minutes. I think we have to understand that there has been a dispute in the American foreign policy community writ large, and in the Obama administration itself at the highest reaches about the entire Syrian civil war, what Richard was talking about earlier, right? You know, since the end of the Cold War, in a number of situations analogous to this, the United States has told itself that these civil wars are producing terrible consequences, and we have to intervene for humanitarian reasons just to stop the killing. And we have two voices at the senior reaches of the administration, the ambassador to the UN and the National Security Advisor, who were very active in these debates for the last 20 years, have very strong views about what should be done. And if you listen again to the speeches about this, almost in every speech that's about a response to the chemical weapons, the ostensible use of chemical weapons, there's an addendum about how we're going to structure this attack to change the balance of power in the country and move the regime closer to willingness to negotiate on the basis of a framework that was discussed at Geneva some time ago, a very loose framework, right? The Obama administration finally broke down some months ago and agreed they would start sending some weapons to some rebel groups, ostensibly, again, Rumant, the first American-trained and armed group in Jordan, crossed into Syria sometime in the last couple of weeks. I'm not confident that the president knows his own mind. I think the president gave lots of evidence that he didn't want to be in this war, but at the same time, he surrounds himself with people who do want to be in this war, right? And you know, now we're in the realm of human emotions and trying to psychoanalyze a person I've never met, happens to be our president, brilliant man. I have a lot of respect for him. But, you know, you can listen to this president and you could hear a kind of a realist, Bush one kind of statesman, and you can hear a Hillary Clinton liberal interventionist save the world statesman. You can hear both of those statesmen out of this president depending on when you're listening to him. I think there's a war in this man's head. And it doesn't just happen in his head, it's happening in his administration. And you know, there's an old saying from Vietnam, which I won't tell you why, but some of you will know it, play Cruiser like streetcar. There'll be another one along in 10 minutes, right? This particular incident provided an opening for a lot of folk who want to get into this war. And if you listen to the way the Americans sometimes talk about the strike, they're not just talking about having an effect on chemical weapons, they're talking about having an effect on the whole war. Changing the balance of power in the war in a way that will force the regime to the negotiating table, although what they don't say is when Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State, Mrs. Clinton and other members of the administration said, well, our negotiating position is that Assad must go. So what does it mean to force Assad to the negotiating table when our going-in position is Assad must go? Well, if to get him to negotiate that means that you really do have to render the regime helpless, right? That's how much military power it's going to take, right? So I'm not telling you that I know which one of these interpretations is dominant. In fact, I think all four are kind of floating and relating to one another. And I think they add up to a motivation to do the strike, which I think was probably the beginnings of what would have been a deeper involvement. Who knows where it would have ended. Now, just to close, where are we now? I'm not following the technicalities very well, but in the last 36 hours, it's pretty clear that the Russian offer has precipitated a discussion about the modalities. Jeanne has talked a little bit about some of the technical, administrative, legal modalities, which are very complicated. But there's also a basic diplomatic choice about modalities in the United Nations about what kind of resolution, Security Council resolution, would start the music here, right? And for those of you who are military law adepts, is it a Chapter 6 resolution? Is it a Chapter 7 resolution? Chapter 7 resolutions are about threats to international peace and security, and they mean that the Security Council is licensing the use of force. Chapter 6 doesn't mean that, right? The Americans want to come out of this process a Security Council resolution that basically points the finger at the Assad regime and says, you will do this or you will get hit, right? And it's not a prayer in the world that the Russians or the Chinese are going to sign on to that, right? So there's probably going to be two choices here, and you can tell, I think you'll be able to tell just how committed the Obama administration is to all of these objectives that I talked about, restoring deterrence, restoring our influence in the Middle East, changing the balance of power, on whether or not they're willing to compromise on this issue. If they're not willing to compromise on the issue, if they're not willing to compromise on this Chapter 7 business, which I personally think is not that big a compromise anyway, but if they're not willing to compromise, I think they're looking for trouble. I mean, they're looking to get into the fight. And if they are willing to compromise, they're looking to get out of the fight. And if they are willing to compromise, it looks more like an effort to return the question of chemical weapons use to the question of international law and internationally enforced norms. Whereas if they don't, it's, as people like to say in relationships, it's all about me. It's all about us. Thank you.
Three really great presentations. Now, we would like to take some questions, and I'll just have to ask you to be brief and to the point, please.
Sure. So regarding the change of balance of power, in the case of Iraq, Syria, or Bosnia, it was these countries, they were alone. Here we have Russia and Iran, and where they were not taking into consideration when Obama said, and number two, whose war is this? Is it the Gulf or is it America? I mean, I know that they're using the money from the Gulf, but who has the biggest interest in this war on priority? Is it the Gulf or
Well, there's no question that without the money from the Gulf, the opposition would not be able to sustain itself. There's no question about that. And there's no question that without the intervention of significant religious authorities, Yusuf Qaradawi, for example, who after the Hezbollah intervention in al-Qusayr declared the individual responsibility of Muslims to participate in jihad in Syria. These have had really decisive roles in terms of the conflict. But I also think we need to take into account other regional players, not just Iran. Iraq, next door to Syria, after all, led by a government that the U.S. had something to do with putting in place, has very much taken the side of the regime in Damascus. They have no particular interest in an outcome that will see the regime falling and a majority Sunni population taking over and aligning with the opposition Sunni minority within Iraq. So, I mean, I think this needs to be taken into account as well. The fact of the matter is that I think people who say that there is no outcome here that is feasible without, if you will, a negotiated process are correct. But I must say I'm much stymied by the question of how we get there. And it does seem to me, to pick up on comments that Professor Posen made, that the chemical weapon issue, and let's face it, the initiative from the standpoint of the Soviet Union, does provide some purchase on the beginning of a dialogue. I mean, there's an election next year in Syria, ha ha ha, but there's an election next year. That may provide a structure, if you will, for a context of discussion. Now, I don't think, given the regional balance of forces and everything else, that the Syrians are going to instantly disarm themselves of chemical weapons. And so, in fact, those chemical weapons are there, by the way, not to attack civilians, although they've been used for that purpose, apparently, but it's intended as a deterrent to Israel. I mean, that's the strategic rationale for those weapons, because the Syrians don't have a nuclear arsenal. The Israelis have weapons of mass destruction, and this is the counter. So, you know, I don't expect an effective outcome, but I do expect that the only outcome that makes sense is a negotiated one, which is going to intricately balance the interest of all these players, the Gulf states, Egypt increasingly, which has really changed position after the toppling of Morsi, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and so on, and even little Lebanon.
If I could say something here, I think the minute you had August 21st and you had the pictures of the dead children, you had an international issue. And that might be chemical weapons as a doorway, you know, to more international intervention and maybe just some framework for negotiation. I would just offer that.
And it wouldn't be a bad thing to have a Syrian government that at least signs, even if it doesn't ratify the convention. Yeah.
Why don't you?
Okay.
John.
Chris?
I wonder if we're not, in effect, burying the lead here, and the story has moved well beyond these important questions. To the simple point that the American people somehow, British and Congress, have decided they don't want to go to war over this, period. And the president didn't acknowledge it last night, but he's having to deal with it. He was ready to go, seriously ready, right? And then the British voted, and then people started counting returns in Congress, and the consensus was overwhelming that no, we don't want to do this. It's a bad idea. And then Putin comes in with an escape route, so that all these considerations, what do we want, sort of go out the window. He's been scooped. He's scooped by consensus in Congress and by, hey, we'll hold the chemicals, and by Britain, and by the Pope, and by the UN Secretary, and by the EU. Like, no, whoa, we're not going to go.
Well, I can't disagree with you. You preface your remark by saying, like, we're missing the story, and I guess I would sort of say that the story is even more interesting, which is that you have a national security establishment in the United States that's used to these arguments working. And here I talk about Democrats and Republicans, right? The Democratic foreign policy elite, the Republican foreign policy elite, the British foreign policy elite. People are used to the certain set of arguments working as they worked in the first 10 years after the Cold War ended, as they worked in the beginning of the global war on terror. They're used to them working, and they seem to have been, in some sense, tactically surprised. In other words, they launched a political offensive to have a war, and were astonished to find out that they ran into really significant insurgent resistance, right? In populations across the Western world that just said, nah, not really. And they said, but what about this? Nah, not really. What about that? Nah, not really. Right? And so the question is here, what's going on in the body politic? In other words, is this simple war weariness, which you often find when great wars come to an end? Publics and governments just back away. In this particular case, the war weariness seems to be concentrated in a public which really wasn't even that affected by the wars, but somehow they're just feeling their bones that they've had enough. And I have to say, you know, I'm listening. Maybe NPR cherry picks its person on the street interviews, but when you listen to Americans tell you why they don't want to do this, I go, this person didn't take a course that I offered. How come they understand the issues so well? There's just lots of people out there who seem to have actually thought this thing through and have reasons, right? So, if it's not war weariness, it's something else. In other words, is this you know, at long last, after a very long period, a kind of sea change in attitudes towards foreign policy? Is it the end of the Cold War foreign policy blank check that democratic governments across the Western world had? And are we in some different space? And is this not a one-off, but maybe the beginning of something else? Now, I don't know. These are just hypotheses, but as long as you're talking about game changers, I think the game change could be bigger. And as I was joking to my spouse, I said, 15 or 20 years from now, is someone going to say, you know, the day the British Parliament voted against it, is this the day the post-Cold War world ended and some other world started? Now, again, you know, when you don't have enough political science knowledge, you turn literary or poetical, right? So, you know, you raise a good point, and it's another set of questions we have to kind of hold up in the air and say, what's the evidence telling us about these working hypotheses?
Anybody, gentleman over here on the back? You, yes. Speaking to the mic, actually.
Oh, there's a
No,
mic.
if you speak into the mic.
Oh,
Maybe you should
Yeah, sorry.
line up at the mic.
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Is it possible that part of the government's plan is to actually more or less chase a significant number of the moderates out of the country? I know absolutely for sure that the IDPs and refugees amount to more than 34%, absolutely for certain. A lot of them aren't being counted going to Turkey. I'm part of a humanitarian aid network, so I have a lot of communication. And I'm just wondering why they're being so vicious toward the people, and then even villages and areas that they completely flatten. They've been going back and poisoning the water supplies so that people can't resettle. And I have to ask why, and I just want to weigh in on what you might have to say about that.
Well, my understanding of the situation is that in terms of the total number of refugees, first of all, there are about 2 million altogether. And the lion's share is in Lebanon. I mean, the largest segment is in Lebanon, about 750,000, and about 550 to 600,000 in Jordan, and then smaller numbers elsewhere. I mentioned Iraq and so on.
But a lot of the ones going to Turkey aren't being counted as refugees.
Yes, and I think the numbers on Turkey are something like 350,000, and they may well be higher than that. Fair enough. But certainly, I think the government has come to the conclusion, and here we're talking about basically 2 military units, basically the Presidential Guard and the 4th Division, which are each about 25,000, have come to the conclusion there are parts of the country they cannot control, basically the periphery of the country. And rather than allowing their opposition to use those areas as bases, they basically make them very difficult to inhabit. And with periodic shelling, harassment, bombing, and that kind of thing. I think certainly this is part of the overall strategy of the war. And basically to deny the rebels the sea in which they swim, which is to say the people. And in some significant measure, they've succeeded. And of course, one of the secondary effects of this is an incredible burden on the international community, which has basically underfunded the relief of refugees. I mean, UNHCR, I think, is getting about 50% of the funds they say they actually need. And of course, there are pitiful efforts in country, within Syria, to basically provide for the people who have been displaced, in many cases, more than once or twice or 3 or 4 times. So I certainly think this is part of the government strategy. If I could say one other thing. On the rebel side, you have a sort of multiplicity of these militias that I referred to, which basically become businesses. I mean, they're in the protection racket. They're basically engaged in behaviors that we would say are criminal. They're intimidating people. They're killing people and beating people up who disagree with them or won't support them or whatever. So some significant number of people are not just fleeing government attempts to annihilate them, but the, if you will, the sort of criminal components of the militias, which are not inconsiderable. And of course, you have a state militia, so-called Shabiha, kind of state-mandated militia which supports government objectives, but then also has license to sort of rape, pillage, and steal. I mean, because they're not paid. Basically, they pay themselves on the basis of seizing what they can, stealing what they can, ravishing what they can.
You probably shouldn't ignore the possibility that that if indeed you can show that the regime is trying to move people, and I think Richard's hypothesis about one reason is one we've seen in many other insurgencies. You know, this whole idea of draining the sea. You've seen it in other insurgencies, but you know, refugees are problems for the countries that receive them. They're problems for Jordan. They're problems for Turkey. And you know, Turkey and Jordan have both, one way or the other, been involved in helping the rebels and facilitating the movement of arms. So you can't ignore the hypothesis that this is Assad's regime's way of saying thank you, right? You're going to intervene in my politics. I'm going to intervene in yours, right? I can commend to you Kelly Greenhill's book, Weapons of Mass Migration. It was a book written here at MIT that makes this kind of argument as a not uncommon strategy in international politics.
Here's the mic.
Yes, you, right here. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Speak up, though. Speak up, so.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I actually have a lot of short questions. Professor Posen.
Maybe you should just pick 2 or 3. There's dozens of other people here.
So the same source of intelligence that says that it was most probably the Syrian government who used chemical weapons. It was actually it was the German intelligence.
Yeah.
So what makes and it's exactly the same source that led to the Iraq War. So the weapons of mass destruction, the information came from Germany.
Yes.
And so what makes you believe that this time it's right? And you talked about the motives of the rebels. You said there are some motives, but we know that the rebel that most, if they used it, I'm not saying I don't know it, but what, I mean, it's most likely they have to be really well organized, and we know that the rebels that are most organized are like al-Nusra and the more fundamentalists. So why would they ask for American support? Like, they're against America. Why would they want the Americans to intervene? And I'm actually quite sad that we are having this discourse about intervention and not intervention. It's not only the US that is unsure about it, but Syrians themselves, some of them are actually preparing. They are looking forward for American intervention. Some are so against it. So I actually talked to another professor who suggested to convince Israel to install in the Golan Heights some of their forces there and then pressure or push Assad back. And that would weaken his power, and we wouldn't have to, or the US wouldn't have to intervene in the first place. So why aren't we talking about other options, but only about to intervene or not to intervene? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, as I said to you about the intelligence, I didn't say that hypothesis was necessarily true either. All I'm saying is we have mixed evidence to support all 3 of these hypotheses. I've seen enough evidence, not just from this German report, but from other leaks, to suggest to me that this is a credible hypothesis, and it just happens to be the one that's more consistent with a motive analysis than any others. Remember, I talked about means and motive, right? So I'm not asking you to bet your mortgage on that particular hypothesis of what transpired. All I'm suggesting to you is it would be perfectly reasonable for anybody who's watching this carefully to say the case is not yet made, right? We had a very interesting op-ed by a Democrat in the pages of the New York Times on Saturday, a member of the president's own party, who described the quality of the intelligence they'd seen to the extent that he's allowed to do it, the processes by which you have to go to see the intelligence, And this congressman was basically saying, they're not making it easy for us to accept their arguments. The government, my party, is not making it easy for us to believe the government's intelligence story. They're making it hard. There's all kinds of other bits of chaff around this as well, right? So all I'm saying is you'd be well within the rights of a skeptical citizen to say, case not yet made, right? Give us more, because there are viable alternative hypotheses, right? You don't have to believe anything, and you certainly don't have to believe me, right? Now the question of al-Nusra, right? Well, this is a, now I'll wax poetical again, but it is a strategy story. Politics, alliances, civil wars make strange, let's say, bedfellows, right? So the problem that's in front of the rebels now is that the Assad regime seems to have about 100,000 or so pretty good troops that are pretty heavily armed, that get resupplied by the Iranians and the Russians, right? And the rebels have tried, with the assistance of arms from their outside backers, to crack this defense, and they failed. So what mechanism have we seen crack this kind of defense in the past, since 1990? U.S. air power. It cracked it in Kosovo, right? It cracked it in Bosnia. It cracked it in Libya, right? In some sense, it cracked it in Iraq twice, right? So if you can get the Americans to do a flyby for you, change the balance of power, particularly after the Americans said they're not really coming, what is not to like about this situation? You can rent the American Air Force for a couple of days.
Just about putting them, like the Germans, they put the Patriots on the Turkish border. I'm
Yeah,
not saying to go inside.
Sure, but you have to. There's plenty of things you could do. There's things you could do from Turkey. There's things you could do from Israel. You could launch fighter planes. You can launch multiple launch rocket systems. You can launch ATACMS. You can launch SAMs. You can do all kinds of things if you want to be in the war. So far, the Turks don't want to be in the war. The Israelis don't want to be in the war. The Jordanians don't want to be in the war. They want to help other people be in the war. The Israelis attack Syria only under one condition, right? And that is when they think the Syrians are giving something to Hezbollah that they don't want Hezbollah to have. That's when they attack. They've done it 3 times. They'll do it 3 more times, 10 more times, however many times they have to. That's when they attack, because that's when they think there's a threat to themselves. Otherwise, you're not going to get them into this game, and you're sure not going to get them into this game alone without a big coalition, right, that makes it not look like the usual thing in the Middle East that has often been, an issue or an organizing principle since 1948, which is it's the Zionist Crusader state against the Dodi patriotic locals. Nobody wants to start that morality play up again. It's not a winner politically.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions. The man at the mic, please.
Yeah, the United States not only doesn't have a duty and a right to intervene in Syria, it doesn't have the moral standing since it's used chemical weapons itself so often in the past, and it's continued to do so recently because white phosphorus isn't regulated under the CWC. And even though the United States has ratified the Biological Weapons Treaty, it still does not allow spot checks on its laboratory, so there's really no effective enforcement mechanism. Now, if we're talking about red lines, Obama's drawn a red line on chemical weapons, but Ban Ki-moon and Lakhdar Brahmini have asked him to draw, and all Western governments and others in the region, to draw a red line on providing arms to the rebels as well as to the Syrian government. So if we're going to draw red lines, these are very selective red lines that we're drawing, and we need to enforce the ban on weapons because those can kill as many people as chemical weapons can, which makes it a little hollow when the United States tries to make this a moral case when it focuses simply on chemical weapons while it continues to provide armed support for the rebels in parallel with that, doesn't it?
Well, the only question here, I think, is a chemical weapons interpretation question, and what ugly weapons that have a chemical-like quality have been left out of the convention, and maybe Jeanne is...
Well, let's just go back. Can the United States take the moral high ground in terms of compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. We have been compliant with the Chemical Weapons Convention, as has Russia, by the way. So sure, let's take let's take the high ground. If you're talking about use of chemical weapons in Vietnam, for example, or you're talking about use of incendiaries in World War II, well, then you're in another area. Incendiaries are not actually not considered chemical weapons. All right, incendiaries are another issue. So you could go into, well, what's a chemical agent, what's not a chemical agent, what's in the treaty, what's out of the treaty. The important ones that are in the treaty, and they're the ones that we know, and they're the ones that make up the arsenals. So it's the nerve gases, it's mustard, it's phosgene, and maybe one or two others. So I really disagree with you on the moral high ground. But maybe even much more important than that is really what can the United Nations do? And a lot of people don't know this, but back in 1982, the Secretary General of the United Nations was given what was called investigative power. And it's a very broad latitude. It comes up, it's in the records, certainly, of the United Nations. But it was around the time when the United Nations was getting concerned about Saddam Hussein and the Iran-Iraq War. And what they did was give the Secretary General power that he has now, which is to bring forces in, to organize investigative units, and to organize what would we call this a concerned international community around the issue of the violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, okay, and the Geneva Protocol. It would be both, actually. So, I keep thinking, if we were going to write a scenario, suppose somebody said to you, tell me what you think this is going to look like in 1 month. Isn't that a nice exercise? What is this going to all be like in 1 month? And you can throw together this analysis, throw it all, put it all together. And by the way, don't forget the work of John Tirman in all his wonderful analyses of other wars, by the way, and other people's lives. Throw it all together and say to yourself, what is this going to look like in a month? Or, all right, let's be good about it. Let's 3 months. Let's make it easier. Let's say 3 months. What will you have? What will come out of it? And my guess, my hope, I guess, is not my guess, but my hope is a more rational approach. I think people are actually tired of the use of force, and not tired of the use of force. They see that it doesn't get you anywhere. I think it's American pragmatism. I don't think it's weariness. I think they say, you know what, why do we keep doing the same thing over and over and it doesn't do any good? So I don't think we're tired of it in the sense of, oh, war. I think they're tired of it in the sense of we don't get what we want out of this. So can we get something out of rationality? Can we get something out of the rule of law? Can we get something out of, let's say, the International Criminal Court? Why don't we talk more about the International Criminal Court? Well, we're not going to talk about that right now because President Assad would be the first person, probably, I think, that you might bring to the International Criminal Court. Anyway, I don't know that I've answered your question, but you did encourage me to think.
Please.
Hi. Okay, so this might be too emotional an analysis of the situation. Okay. So, or maybe too simplistic, but there's always the memory of we'll always be regretful that we didn't go in sooner when Germany was using gas on its own people in World War II. And I know that we don't have nearly enough information to know if it's anywhere near the same sort of situation, but I was just wondering if there were any ideas about how we could get that information or how that plays in to this decision, and also if there could possibly be an element of prejudice in this war weariness of the American people.
Two good questions.
You know, I think that the fact that a number of different bodies have responded to what's happened in Syria and declared that the behavior of the government is basically opprobrious, it's morally obnoxious, including the Arab League, which is not the most effectual institution in the world, but nonetheless, while the Arab League has not endorsed armed intervention in Syria. They certainly have spoken out very loudly against the regime. And in fact, you know, the Syrian seat in the Arab League was basically, basically closed to the Syrians. They weren't allowed to occupy it by the Arab League. So I think there's a certain value in using, if you will, the moral indictment against the Assad regime as a strong lever. It's too bad that the U.S. does not belong to the International Court of Justice, for example.
Yeah.
Because I think,
or the ICC.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this would be an opportunity to really highlight the criminality of what's happened in the sort of grossest terms, and this would really sort of further undermine the ground on which many of the key figures in the regime stand upon. So I don't think we should really underestimate the importance of this, particularly in terms of shaping public opinion and so on, not least in the Muslim world and the Arab world.
Is there a corollary to, you're talking about the use of Cyclone B in Germany, and is there some corollary that we should be looking at here that we should have responded, why didn't we respond to the more general issue of the Holocaust, let's say, and we're not responding to it? Well, we do this over and over again, and that's why I make reference to John Tirman's work, is that the lives of others don't count much. When do the lives of others count for us? And if it were 1,000 people killed with chemical weapons, here, then there would be a really strong reaction. Look at the reaction we had to 9/11, by the way. Really amazingly strong, transformed policy, transformed our federal government, turned us into a surveillance state in many ways, absolutely enormous impact. But when it happens somewhere else, what is our level of empathy? How do we empathize with that? And I think it's a very difficult question. The visuals, though, I think are tremendously important. I think back to the poster, the Vietnam poster of the little girl who was, had been hit by napalm running down the street, and how that really affected American opinion, to see that child being attacked by an incendiary is a terrible, terrible thing, and it really did change opinion. And I think the pictures of the children who died in the August 21 attack, I think it really affects people. I think everybody's gotten those images. I think they do see them. The quandary is what to do. The quandary is how to do it. And I can see. It's so, I mean, I'm one of these people who believes that violence begets violence. So I'm not a good person to say, well, do you believe in a strike? Because I don't believe in a strike. I never did. I thought it was a bad idea. But I do think that there are other things that we should be thinking about. And the problem for the Americans, and this is on the high moral ground issue, is that for so very long in terms of arms control, we have had a very bad record, and people don't really know how bad that record is, and I didn't even speak about it today. But the ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention was delayed from 1993 to 1997 because of Strom Thurmond and conservatives in the US Senate who blocked it and blocked it and blocked it and blocked it until 1997. It was a disgrace. And even at the very signing, by the way, even though George Bush had put this treaty forward and people had worked on it and Americans were known to be, and he was known to be in favor of it. When you got to the actual signing, you have over 100 countries lining up to sign, and Lawrence Eagleburger was there, and he kept running out of the room and on the phone, and people were literally on the floor going, is the United States going to sign? What are they doing? Why are they waiting so long? See, if they had signed at the beginning, it was sort of the idea of they'll sign and then we'll follow, and people were waiting for that. They had expected the U.S. to be among the first to sign. They were among the last to sign. And what was Eagleburger getting? He was getting messages back about Congress doesn't like this, Congress doesn't like that, we don't like this, we don't like that. So we have very, our arms control record is not great. And the issue about the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, we were being told what to do by people in Congress who never saw an international treaty that they didn't hate. And that That went on for years in our country, and it was a very Reagan administration thing, and I think we have to get out of it. If we can get out of it, I think it'd be a better world.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're well over our time. I'm sorry for the ones who did not get their questions. Thank our guests, please.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Thank you.
4 to 5:30.
Oh,